In this chapter, we're going to explore the concept of listening. We're going to do so by first coming to understand how and why we listen, then the importance of listening, the different styles and types of listening that we engage in, some barriers to listening that we might encounter, and finally, how we can improve our listening. So first, let's talk about understanding how and why we listen. Listening is often overlooked as an important part of the communication process. And adults spend about 45% of our time listening, and this is more than any other communication activity. So it's a really important part of interpersonal communication that we just don't talk about much and that we don't think about much. So let's take a look at the process of listening. Now, we are going to talk about steps of listening, but it's important for us to recognize that these steps, quote unquote, don't unfold in a really linear fashion, a step-by-step fashion in actuality. When we are actually listening, it's happening very quickly, and oftentimes these different steps overlap with one another. But in order to better understand the process, we are going to look at it step by step. So the first part of listening is receiving. Before we can engage in anything else, we have to take in the stimuli through our senses. And this is an automatic response that happens in our body when our eardrums encounter sound waves. When we talk about the listening process, at this point in the process, we are only still hearing the message. So we are not doing anything with the stimuli that we have taken in. We are not processing that information in any way. We are simply taking in that stimuli and deciding what stimuli to pay attention to. And it's also important to recognize that we can take this information in through auditory means as well as visual ones, right? We can listen with our eyes just like we can with our ears. The next step of the listening process is interpreting. When we interpret the message, this is when we start to try to make meaning out of the information that we have gathered. So we're starting to understand the stimuli that we have received, and this is when we start kind of organizing that information into the different schemata that are in our brains, and we really try to figure out, okay, what is happening here? What is this stimuli? What does this all mean? Next, we recall the information. This is when we transfer the information that we have taken in into either our short-term or long-term memory. So we are organizing and interpreting the data, and they're making their way into our memory. However, overall, our memories are fairly fallible, and we tend to forget about half of what we hear almost immediately after we've heard it. And 8 hours after we heard a message, we only recall 35% of that message. And after a full day, it's down to 20%. So while we do transfer some of the information into our memory banks, it's important to recognize that our memory, our ability to recall, is fallible in that way. The next step in listening is evaluating. This happens when we make judgments about the credibility of a message, the completeness of a message, and the worth of the message. So when we are evaluating the things that we are hearing, or the things that we are listening to in this case, we are determining the degree to which we believe a speaker's statements are correct and or true. We're trying to do things like read in between the lines to assess the message for how complete it is. And we're trying to make value judgments about whether we think that the message is good or bad, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. And then finally, we are responding to the message. So when we respond, we are sending feedback channel cues to the speaker. So these back channel cues are verbal and nonverbal signals that we send whenever someone is talking. So when we are in conversation with someone, we will do things like nod our head, make direct eye contact, lean forward, present vocal cues like, uh-huh, right, oh, and respond non-verbally and sometimes verbally in those ways. We might also do things like paraphrase or ask clarifying questions as a response to the message that we are hearing. So when we are listening, we are receiving, interpreting, recalling, evaluating, and responding to the stimuli, to the messages that we are encountering in our everyday lives. And remember, we aren't necessarily going through these steps step by step, right? In most cases, these things are all happening instantaneously to the point where we don't even realize that that's what our brains are doing. But this is the listening process nonetheless.